Well, I just couldn't be more thrilled to be here, and I'm just mystified that I'm up here talking to all of you. It just doesn't seem like it could have been 25 years ago that I was coming through here and that I'm talking about the decade of the 90s. It just feels amazing, and I'm just really grateful and honored to be here. The title of my talk is Cooperation During Booms and Busts, and that part of it I was inspired by having my first day at the Institute, walking into the building and seeing the bust of Gene Odum and going, oh my gosh, that's so cool. Now, this was before the time of selfies, but that's what I would have done had I been able to. And I walked down the hallway, and here comes the man himself. Like, boom, you know? Like, whoa, I can't believe that happened. But of course, this title has another meaning too. And so Gene used the word cooperation, and we can think of collaboration, mutualistic interactions as being so important in sustaining ecosystems during times of change, booms and busts. And we might think about that for other kinds of systems, ecosystems, social systems, institutions, and that's the perspective that I want to bring today. And like the others have said, it was hard to figure out what to say because this is a picture of my bookshelf at FIU, and I looked through, you know, all these books and so many ways in which the science of this place has informed my career from the very outset. And so, you know, we use this red book, and my general ecology course is an undergraduate at Kent State. Boom, 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 all these really important works that have come out of here. And when I was here as a Ph.D. student, Frank Golly had us reading the Foundations of Ecology book that had just come out. And so, you know, how do I isolate this period of the 90s and talk about the meaning of the work that was being done then to my career when, in fact, there's just this huge legacy of so much work that had mattered so much all the way along. So I drew out this paper that Odum wrote in 1992. It's the Great Ideas in Ecology for the 90s, where he kind of summarizes some of the major things that we have learned, like 20 different categories of learnings in ecology. And I wanted to really highlight two of them. Ecosystems are far from equilibrium, and resource scarcity leads to codependency. And of course, these two things are highly related to each other, and we can use the strategy or the strategy of ecosystem development model to understand that, right? So the 69 seminal paper on this that shows how ecosystems go through a process of succession, building up primary production, and then the consumers catch up and the respiration increases and things begin to level off in this mature phase. And Odum has a wonderful table in that paper that categorizes all the different kinds of properties of early and mid and mature systems. And that includes this concept that mature systems may have more evidence of codependency because nutrient cycles are internal and somewhat limiting, and that leads to a lot of mutualistic interactions. And he would say things like cooperation for mutual benefit is a really important survival strategy, that these multiple interactions of occurring within communities are a stabilizing force. This concept was really important to me in my master's work that I did at Iowa State and that I was just wrapping up into publications when I came here. And that work, I was studying a bunch of lakes across the Midwest, looking at zooplankton, and those zooplankton were full of little epizoic riders, little diatoms riding around on them. And it turned out that there was one species that was really common, and that seemed to only live there, and this is Synedra cyclopum riding around on a Daphnia. And again, in that first couple of weeks of being here, I ran into Dr. Odum in the copy room, and he said, well, what are you working on? Always so curious. And I said, well, I'm wrapping up these papers from my master's work on epizoic mutualism. And he said, well, what a wonderful little mutualism that is. And I'll never forget that. Oh, Dr. Odum thinks that what I'm working on is a wonderful little mutualism. And he said, now I bet that interaction is a lot more common in the most nutrient-poor lakes that you've sampled. And I was like, well, that isn't actually something that I'm looking at, but maybe I should. And so I brought that into this paper that I was finishing up. And, sure enough, yeah, the most nutrient-limited lakes had more of these little diatoms riding around on the Daphnia, especially on the post-abdomen, where those nutrients are coming out, and the diatom is like, yay, some nutrients. And the little animal is constantly growing a garden on its back, and that's also really a great thing during a nutrient-limited situation. So very influential impact on me early in my career, directly on my master's work. And then moving forward into my PhD, other aspects of the strategy of development model became important too. And so I wanted to bring up this idea of pulse stability that Wexin also talked about, and that had later in the Odum 1995 paper has been, sort of began to be talked about as a pulse paradigm. In that these pulses of drivers are really important in reorganizing ecosystems in a way that allows them to continue to develop. And this idea of disturbance as an organizing force in ecosystems was really a very central concept, I feel like, when I was here at the Institute. And I know I sat in Judy Meyer's stream ecology discussion group once a week, where we were reading papers on disturbance in stream communities and trying to understand the role of disturbance. What is disturbance? Why does it matter? And this continues to be such an important body of study and mobilized a lot of the kinds of work that was being done, like at the COWIDA LTER program. And so Odum talks about pulse stability, and he actually uses a lot of wetland examples, and in fact focuses on the Everglades as the cool habitat that goes wet and dry, and that those pulses really matter to what we observe out there. And I think this idea is equally applicable to sort of institutional dynamics, as I mentioned at the beginning. And I just wanted to call out the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory, which is where I did the bulk of my dissertation research, as a place that kind of exhibits this pulse stability. And I just drew out the trajectory of changes that occurred there over the years. When the Atomic Energy Commission established things in the 50s, and Frank Gully came in and began to look at the sorts of things that could be done in an institution like that, and said, well, we have this grounding in radioecology, but let's diversify. We have a landscape that is full of all these incredible habitats, opportunities to conduct long-term studies, and he diversified the programs at SREL and enabled SREL to grow and grow and grow. By the time I was there, it was a huge assembly of faculty and grad students and lots of energy. And then subsequently, well, we were always worrying about funding from DOE, and that was always a struggle. But then in the early 2000s, that major crash in funding for this facility really hurt SREL and caused some major reassembly in ways that were really, really hard. Faculty losses of graduate student support. But what did that result in over the long haul? Well, a major reorganization of energy and of direction. and a realization that we not only have to diversify what we do, but we have to diversify our funding streams. And there were some really successful attempts at that, and that enabled SREL to kind of re-emerge and as a, to develop some new areas of study, and that enabled faculty growth once again, student growth once again, and now I read on the website, up to 2,100 publications, and things are going very, very well there. And that's a result of community cooperation, people caring and thinking about what are strategies to keep us growing. Well, this whole idea of pulse stability in ecosystems was somewhat made possible by these super cool habitats on this protected area of the Savannah River site that Gene Odum worked in, the grasslands that he was in, and looking at old field succession and demonstrating these kinds of progressions towards stability in those systems. Well, that whole idea was really important to the work that I ended up doing in Carolina Bays, another protected kind of habitat that was very abundant across the property of Savannah River site. And my major professor was Barbara Taylor, and she was working out in these temporary ponds looking at zooplankton population dynamics and finding that each little pond had a really different hydrology, and every pond that had a different hydrology had a different zooplankton assemblage. And she was really questioning, why is each pond so different from every other pond? Maybe we could learn something about that through a paleoecological approach. And that was the direction I was taking in my work with diatoms. And so we went out and cored lots and lots of Carolina Bays. And I have this picture here. I spent about 10% of the time in the field taking diatom samples and getting sediment cores, and about 90% of the time running away from various organisms ranging from cottonmouths to feral pigs and feral dogs. That was a big part of the experience at SREL. But through all of that work, we were able to identify, using all these diatoms in these sediment cores, a high stand for the development of, this is the Paleo Record here showing the diatom interpreted hydrology, and we found a high stand for the development of wetlands across the Atlantic coastal plain occurring about 4,000 years ago. And that was a time when there was a lot of rainfall occurring in the southeast, lots more ponding enabled on these depressional areas of the landscape that enabled productivity to exceed ecosystem respiration, and for carbon then to accrue. And those sediments then have these wonderful records of assemblages that enable us to reconstruct that. So once again, sort of finding evidence for that predictable succession pattern or an ontogenic pattern in these wetlands. So it was natural when I was looking for jobs and ended up moving down into the Everglades ecosystem to take some of these ideas about reconstructing hydrologic histories and trying to understand the possible futures for wetlands from the perspective of these diatom records, to again, kind of apply that pulse stability and development model from Odum to the Everglades ecosystem. And that was made easier because of this wonderful field trip, and I couldn't remember exactly what year that was in, but the Porters ran a little workshop with a dozen or so graduate students where we learned all about the South Florida ecosystem. And then we took this wonderful field trip in a couple of great big vans all the way down to South Florida and ended up at Bill Fitt's house in the Keys and just had an absolute blast. And we got to see how complicated this crazy Everglades South Florida ecosystem is. Hydrologic variability at all spatial and temporal scales, massive nutrient enrichment problems, great big world scale, a globally recognizable restoration program going on. How exciting. But it was obvious that there were lots of changes going on in the system even then. And in this boat, that's John Chick, who was a student here at the time, and that's the back of Patty Saunders' head. But there were a whole bunch of us on that trip. We really enjoyed it so much. Since then, I just wanted to point out some of the things that we're learning in our LTER program. The Everglades is changing so fast. In some places, so we have sea level rise happening in a very shallow sloping landscape. That means saltwater intrusion. The rate of saltwater intrusion is super high in this ecosystem because we've dried it out so much and there's so much less freshwater moving through. And so if we use the classic Odum model, we would expect that this gradual change in a driver would enable perhaps additional productivity, and in this case, we're seeing transgression, mangroves moving into sawgrass communities in some places, but in other places, we're seeing a complete loss of carbon happening, and we call this process peat collapse. It's being observed in other wetlands around the world as well, where sections of marsh are falling apart, the productivity of the dominant sawgrass is declining, we're losing thousands of years of accumulated carbon to the atmosphere and to downstream waters. And so that phenomenon is something that we're quite concerned about and has motivated a re-examination of the Odum model. And this re-examination was stimulated by John Kamenowski, who we were lucky enough to hire at FIU, and is coming into the leadership of the LTER program. And we're in this process of renewing our program or writing a renewal proposal and thinking about different trajectories that ecosystems may take, reflecting a bit on what Monica talked about, and that we have these novel combinations of extreme changes in drivers that may cause different kinds of dynamics in ecosystems than those we have seen in the past. And so we've taken this model here on the left, the Odum model, and kind of said, well, you know, what happens if we have other kinds of combinations of drivers going on? This middle one is his idea of pulse stability in drivers and presses that are predictable, not completely non-changing, but not changing in any kind of rapid way, that gives us a pulse, an ecosystem that's pulsing towards stability. But we may also have slow changes in presses, amplified pulses, that in some cases may cause resources to become more plentiful and allow the ecosystem to further develop into another kind of state. And that's similar to what, or an example of that is the transgression of mangroves into sawgrass habitat, where they become much more productive. But we also have this potential for ecosystems to decline and lose carbon if we have presses changing in accelerated rates like sea level rise, pulses changing in stochastic ways that may cause a stress for the current communities and that may not be able to adapt at paces commensurate with those changes in drivers. And that may cause ecosystems to decline. And so what we're thinking about are ways in which human interventions, like through large-scale hydrologic restoration, may allow us to prevent this kind of decline by pushing us more toward a developing trajectory. And that process, of course, requires cooperation across not just ecologists and scientists, but folks who are doing the management aspects and concerned about governance of the ways in which water moves around in the landscape. And so that's a huge part of our LTER program, is that collaboration. And so I just wanted to end on this point that collaboration, the informal interactions that occurred here for me as a student were so important in creating the trajectory that my career has gone on, and I'm always just so incredibly grateful for the experiences that I've had here. And wanted to end with a huge congratulations to the school in this 50-year celebration, and with a huge amount of gratitude toward all of my mentors and faculty and friends who have been so instrumental in allowing my career to evolve. And this is Karen and I. Karen was coming down to Florida quite a bit, and we were so lucky to be able to go fishing together quite a bit. And oh, it was such great memories all the way around. So thank you again so much for this opportunity.